Imagine a man so strong that he could tear apart a lion with his bare hands. A man who could lift the massive gates of an entire city, carry them on his shoulders, and walk away into the hills. A warrior feared by armies. A judge chosen by God. And yet, the same man who possessed supernatural strength was also destroyed by his own weakness. His name was Samson. For centuries, his story has fascinated believers, historians and theologians alike. Some remember him as the strongest man who ever lived. Others remember him as a tragic hero, a man who had everything and still managed to lose it all. But Samson's story is not just about strength. It is about calling. It is about temptation. It is about failure and redemption. Because hidden within this ancient biblical account is a deeply human story. A story about what happens when divine purpose collides with human weakness. And perhaps the most shocking part is this: Samson was chosen by God before he was even born. Long before he lifted a weapon. Long before he fought a single enemy. Before he ever made the choices that would change his life forever, God had already set him apart. But why? Why would God choose a man who would eventually fall into such devastating mistakes? Why give extraordinary power to someone who would struggle so deeply with temptation? And why does the Bible preserve his story so carefully, with all its triumphs and all its failures? To understand the mystery of Samson, we must travel back nearly 3,000 years into one of the darkest periods in the history of Israel, a time when the nation had no king, a time when chaos ruled the land. The Bible describes this period with a haunting sentence: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Israel had fallen into a dangerous cycle. They would turn away from God. Foreign enemies would rise and oppress them. Then, in desperation, the people would cry out for deliverance. And again, God would send someone to rescue them. These leaders were known as judges. They were not kings. They were not politicians. They were chosen individuals raised up by God to save Israel from its enemies and lead the people back toward Him. Some judges were warriors. Some were prophets. Some were unlikely heroes. But none were quite like Samson, because Samson was different from the very beginning. Before he was born, an angel appeared to his mother with a message that would change everything. Her child would not live an ordinary life. He would be set apart for God from the moment of his birth. He would take a sacred vow known as the Nazirite vow, a sign of total dedication to God. No wine, no touching anything unclean, and most importantly, his hair would never be cut. This long hair would become the visible symbol of his covenant with God, and through this covenant, God would give him extraordinary strength. But Samson's strength was never meant to be just physical. It was meant to serve a divine purpose, because at that time, Israel was under the control of a powerful enemy, the Philistines. For 40 years, the Philistines ruled over Israel with intimidation and force. Their armies were strong. Their cities were fortified. Their culture was spreading across the land. Israel was slowly losing its identity. And into this troubled world, Samson was born, a child destined to begin the deliverance of God's people. But here is the mystery that makes Samson's story so unforgettable. Despite his divine calling, despite the miracles surrounding his birth, despite the power God placed upon his life, Samson would constantly walk a dangerous line between faithfulness and rebellion. He would defeat enemies no ordinary man could face. Yet he would also make choices that shocked those around him. He would experience moments of incredible victory and moments of heartbreaking weakness. His life would become a dramatic collision between God's purpose and human desire. And eventually, that collision would lead to one of the most tragic and powerful endings in the entire Bible. But to truly understand how Samson rose to such legendary strength, and how he fell so deeply into darkness, we must first step into the world he was born into, a world of war, a world of oppression. a world desperately waiting for a deliverer. Because the story of Samson did not begin with his battles, it began with a promise. A promise given by an angel, a promise that would shape the destiny of a man whose name would echo through history. And what happened next would change the fate of Israel forever. But the real story is only just beginning. To understand the story of Samson, we must step into a time when Israel was fragile, divided, and constantly threatened. This was the era known as the time of the Judges, a turbulent period in biblical history recorded in the book of Judges, roughly between 1200 and 1050 BC. Israel had already entered the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua. The great conquest of Canaan was over, but the victory had not been complete. Many powerful enemy groups still lived within the land, and slowly those enemies began to grow stronger. The Israelites, who were supposed to remain faithful to God, started drifting away. They adopted foreign customs. They worshipped pagan idols. They forgot the covenant that had once defined their nation. This spiritual decline created a dangerous pattern that repeated again and again. The Bible describes this cycle clearly. First, the people would abandon God and follow the gods of the surrounding nations. Then, as a consequence, God would allow foreign powers to rise against them. Oppression would follow. Cities would be raided, crops destroyed, families forced into fear and poverty. Eventually, the suffering would become unbearable, and the people would cry out to God for help. And every time they cried out, God responded with mercy. He raised up a leader, a judge, who would deliver Israel from its enemies. These judges were not kings ruling from a throne. They were more like divinely appointed rescuers. Figures like Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, and Jephthah each rose during moments of crisis. Some were military leaders, some were prophets, some were ordinary individuals who God empowered for extraordinary missions. But by the time Samson was born, Israel's situation had become particularly grim. For 40 years, the nation had been dominated by one of its most powerful enemies, the Philistines. The Philistines were not just another local tribe. They were a formidable civilization. Historians believe they were part of the mysterious sea peoples who migrated into the eastern Mediterranean. They eventually settled along the coastal regions of what is now modern-day Israel and Gaza. Unlike many surrounding tribes, the Philistines had advanced technology, especially in iron weaponry. While Israel was still using bronze tools, the Philistines had already mastered iron. Their weapons were stronger, their armies more organized, their cities heavily fortified. 5 major Philistine cities formed a powerful alliance: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. From these strongholds, they controlled trade routes, military power, and political influence across the region. Israel, by contrast, was divided among tribes and lacked centralized leadership. The Philistines imposed their authority through intimidation and control. In some areas, Israelites were even forbidden from producing their own weapons. They had to rely on Philistine blacksmiths to sharpen their farming tools. Imagine a nation unable to defend itself, a people living under the shadow of stronger enemies. Fear had slowly replaced faith, and yet, in the middle of this oppression, God was preparing a deliverer. But this deliverer would not rise from a palace. He would not be born into a royal family. Instead, he would come from a small tribe called Dan. The tribe of Dan lived in a region close to Philistine territory, constantly exposed to their pressure and influence. In a small town called Zorah, a man named Manoah and his wife lived a quiet life. They were ordinary people, but they carried a painful burden. They had no children. In ancient Israel, this was often seen as a deep sorrow. Children were viewed as blessings from God, a continuation of family legacy and hope for the future. For Manoah and his wife, that hope seemed impossible. Until one day, something extraordinary happened. An angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife with a message that would alter the course of history. The angel said, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son." But this would not be an ordinary child. The angel gave very specific instructions. She was not to drink wine or eat anything unclean during her pregnancy. And when the child was born, he must never cut his hair, because the boy would be a Nazirite from birth. The Nazirite vow was a sacred dedication described in the law of Moses. Normally, people would take this vow voluntarily for a limited period of time, but Samson's vow would be different. He would live under it his entire life. His uncut hair would serve as a visible sign of his devotion to God, and the angel revealed the reason behind this calling. He will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Notice the wording carefully. Not finish, not completely destroy, but begin. Samson would start a process that would eventually lead to Israel's freedom. When Manoah later encountered the angel himself, he asked a simple but profound question. What is to be the rule that governs the boy's life? In other words, how do we raise a child destined for such a mission? The angel's answer was clear. This child belonged to God. His life would be guided by a divine purpose. And from the moment he was born, something remarkable began to happen. The Bible tells us, "The boy grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him." Even as a young man, something powerful was awakening within Samson. A strength that was not merely human, a destiny that would soon collide with the enemies of Israel. And when that collision finally happened, the world would witness acts of power unlike anything seen before. But Samson's greatest battles would not only be against the Philistines, they would also be fought within his own heart, and the first of those battles was about to begin. As Samson grew into adulthood, the promise spoken before his birth began to reveal itself. The Spirit of the Lord stirred within him, and with it came an extraordinary strength, a power that set him apart from every other man in Israel. Yet from the very beginning, Samson's story carried an unusual tension. He was chosen by God, but he did not always choose the path God intended. One of the earliest signs of this tension appeared when Samson traveled to the Philistine town of Timnah. There he saw a woman among the Philistines and returned home with a surprising request for his parents. "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." His parents were shocked. In ancient Israel, marriage with the enemy nations was strongly discouraged. Such unions often led people away from their faith and into foreign customs and idol worship. His father and mother tried to reason with him. "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" But Samson insisted, "Get her for me. She is the right one for me." What Samson did not realize was that something deeper was unfolding. The Bible explains that this desire would become the beginning of conflict between Samson and the Philistines, a conflict God would use to challenge Israel's oppressors. So Samson and his parents traveled toward Timnah, and along the road something astonishing happened. A young lion suddenly attacked him. In ancient times, a lion encounter meant certain death for an unarmed traveler. But Samson was no ordinary man. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. With his bare hands he grabbed the lion and tore it apart as easily as someone might tear a young goat. No sword, no spear, just raw strength given by God. And yet Samson told no one what had happened. Days later, as he passed the same road again, he noticed something unusual. Inside the carcass of the lion, a swarm of bees had built a hive. Honey filled the hollow body. Samson scooped out the honey and ate it as he walked, even sharing some with his parents, though he never told them where it came from. This strange moment would soon inspire one of the most famous riddles in the Bible. When Samson arrived in Timnah for his wedding feast, 30 Philistine men were assigned to accompany him as companions. During the celebration, Samson proposed a challenge. He told them a riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. The men had 7 days to solve it. If they succeeded, Samson would give them 30 sets of clothing. If they failed, they would have to give Samson 30 sets instead. The riddle referred to the lion and the honey, but the Philistines could not figure it out. After several days of frustration, they turned to Samson's new wife and threatened her. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death." Terrified, she pressured Samson relentlessly. Day after day she wept, begging him to reveal the answer. Finally, worn down by her pleading, Samson told her the secret. She immediately passed it on to the Philistine men. On the 7th day, just before sunset, they approached Samson with the answer. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson instantly realized what had happened. His response was sharp and bitter. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." Furious at the betrayal, Samson traveled to the Philistine city of Ashkelon. There he struck down 30 Philistine men and took their clothing to pay the wager. Then, burning with anger, he returned to his father's house. His Philistine wife was given to another man. What began as a wedding celebration had now ignited the first sparks of open conflict. Later, Samson returned to visit his wife, only to discover she had been married to someone else. In rage, Samson decided to strike back against the Philistines in a way no one could have expected. He captured 300 foxes. Then he tied their tails together in pairs, fastening a burning torch between each pair. When he released the animals into the Philistine fields, the foxes ran wildly through the crops. Flames spread across grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves. The Philistines watched in horror as their harvest burned. When they discovered that Samson was responsible, they retaliated in brutal fashion. They burned Samson's former wife and her father alive. The violence escalated. Samson responded with devastating force, striking down many Philistines in a fierce attack. Fear spread quickly. Eventually, 3,000 men from the tribe of Judah approached Samson, frightened that his actions would provoke even harsher retaliation from the Philistines. They asked him to surrender. Samson agreed to be bound and handed over, as long as his own people did not kill him themselves. When the Philistines saw Samson arriving in chains, they shouted in triumph. But their victory celebration was short-lived. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson once again. The ropes binding his arms snapped like burned thread. Nearby, Samson found the jawbone of a donkey. With that simple weapon, he struck down 1,000 Philistine men. One man, one bone, 1,000 enemies defeated. But despite these incredible victories, Samson's life was moving toward a dangerous path, because his greatest battle was not against lions or armies. It was against a temptation that would soon change everything, and her name was Delilah. By this point in his life, Samson had become a legend. Stories of his strength spread across the land like wildfire. The Philistines feared him. The Israelites whispered about him with awe. A man who could kill a lion with his bare hands. A warrior who defeated 1,000 soldiers with the jawbone of a donkey. A judge chosen by God to challenge the power of the Philistines. Yet behind this incredible strength, Samson carried a dangerous weakness. Again and again he allowed his heart to be drawn toward the very people he was meant to confront. And that weakness would eventually lead him to a woman whose name would become famous throughout history. Her name was Delilah. The Bible tells us that Samson fell deeply in love with her. She lived in the valley of Sorek, a region near Philistine territory. The Philistine rulers quickly realized something important. If they could discover the secret of Samson's strength, they could finally defeat the man who had humiliated their armies for years. So the 5 Philistine rulers approached Delilah with a proposal. It was a dangerous offer and a very tempting one. See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him. If she succeeded, they promised to reward her with 1,100 pieces of silver each, an enormous fortune. Delilah agreed, and so began one of the most suspenseful and tragic episodes in the entire Bible. One evening, as Samson rested with her, Delilah asked him a simple question. "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered playfully, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." So while Samson slept, Delilah allowed the Philistines to enter the room quietly. They tied him with the bowstrings. Then she shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." Samson woke instantly. With a single movement, the bowstrings snapped like thread. The trap had failed. But Delilah was not finished. She confronted Samson. "You have made a fool of me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." Samson gave another answer. "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." Again, Delilah waited for him to fall asleep. Again, the Philistines hid nearby. Again, she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And once again, Samson broke free effortlessly. But Delilah continued pressing him, day after day, question after question, slowly wearing down his resistance. Finally, Samson gave another explanation. "If you weave the 7 braids of my hair into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with a pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." Delilah followed the instructions carefully. But when Samson awoke, he pulled free again. 3 times she had tried. 3 times she had astride. And yet the most dangerous moment was still coming. Because Delilah changed her strategy. Instead of trickery, she turned to emotional pressure. The Bible describes it in a heartbreaking sentence. With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. Imagine the tension, the constant questioning, the emotional manipulation. Samson, the strongest man alive, was slowly being worn down. And finally, in a moment of exhaustion and misplaced trust, Samson revealed the truth. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he told her, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me." This was the secret. Not magic, not muscles, but a covenant with God. Delilah immediately sensed that this time Samson had told her everything. She summoned the Philistine rulers. "Come back once more. He has told me everything." That night, as Samson slept with his head in her lap, Delilah called a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Slowly, carefully, the symbol of his covenant was removed. And in that quiet moment, everything changed. For the first time in his life, Samson was no longer under the protection of the vow that had set him apart. The Bible records one of the most tragic lines in Samson's story, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. Delilah cried out again, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." Samson woke up confidently, thinking things would be the same as before. "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But this time, nothing happened. His strength was gone. The Philistines rushed in. They seized him, overpowered him, and then, in a brutal act meant to destroy the man who had humiliated them for so long, they gouged out his eyes. The mighty warrior who once terrified armies was now blind and helpless. They bound him with bronze chains and took him to the city of Gaza. There, Samson was forced to grind grain in prison like a slave. The strongest man in Israel reduced to darkness. But the story was not over, because even in that prison, something small began to happen, something almost unnoticed. The Bible quietly says, "But the hair on his head began to grow again," and with it, the possibility of redemption. Samson's story is often remembered for its dramatic moments. The lion torn apart with bare hands, the burning foxes running through the fields, the jawbone that defeated 1,000 warriors, the betrayal of Delilah. But beneath the action and tragedy lies something much deeper. The story of Samson is not simply about physical strength. It is about the tension between divine calling and human weakness. From the moment Samson was born, his life was surrounded by purpose. God had set him apart before he ever took his first breath. His Nazirite vow symbolized a life dedicated to God, a life meant to be different from the surrounding world. His long hair was not magical, it was a sign, a visible reminder that his strength did not come from himself, but from God. Yet throughout his life, Samson often treated that calling casually. Again and again, he drifted toward danger. He sought relationships with the very people who oppressed Israel. He ignored wise counsel. He followed impulse instead of discipline. In many ways, Samson represents a struggle that has existed throughout human history, the struggle between God's purpose and human desire. How often does someone receive incredible gifts and yet misuse them? How often does someone recognize the right path and still wander away from it? Samson's story shows that even someone chosen by God can still face powerful temptation. But it also reveals something even more remarkable. God's plans are not easily destroyed by human failure. Even when Samson made mistakes, even when his anger led him into reckless actions, God continued to work through his life. This does not mean Samson's choices were unimportant. In fact, his decisions had painful consequences. His impulsive marriage led to betrayal and violence. His pride pushed him into dangerous situations. And his relationship with Delilah ultimately led to his capture and humiliation. When the Philistines gouged out his eyes and forced him into slavery, Samson experienced the full weight of those consequences. The man who once walked with confidence now lived in darkness. The warrior who once stood above armies now worked like a prisoner. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. But the Bible quietly reminds us of something powerful. The hair on his head began to grow again. At first glance, that sentence may seem small, but symbolically it carries enormous meaning. Samson's hair represented his covenant with God. Its growth suggests something deeper than physical change. It hints at restoration, because in the darkness of that prison, Samson had time to think, time to reflect, time to recognize where his life had gone wrong. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when a person is brought to their lowest point, when pride is stripped away, when illusions disappear, when the noise of life finally becomes silent enough to hear the truth. In that prison cell, Samson was no longer the arrogant hero who believed he could escape any trap. He was a broken man, and brokenness often becomes the doorway to humility. This is one of the most important spiritual lessons hidden within Samson's story. God does not only work through perfect people. In fact, the Bible repeatedly shows God working through flawed individuals, people who fail, struggle, and sometimes fall deeply. Moses once doubted his ability to lead. David committed terrible sins. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Yet each of these figures became instruments in God's larger plan. Samson fits into that same pattern. His story reminds us that failure does not erase purpose. Even when someone falls, even when they experience consequences for their actions, God's ability to redeem a life remains. But redemption often requires something difficult. It requires surrender. Samson spent years relying on his own strength. Only after losing everything did he finally recognize where his true strength came from. The prison in Gaza became a place of quiet transformation. While the Philistines believed they had destroyed their greatest enemy, something unseen was happening. Samson's hair continued to grow, and with it, the possibility that God was not finished with him yet. Soon, the Philistines would gather for a massive celebration, a festival honoring their god Dagon. They would bring Samson out of prison to entertain them, to mock him, to prove that their God had defeated the man who once terrified them. But they had no idea that the man standing before them, blind and humiliated, was about to become part of one of the most dramatic moments in the entire Bible. Because sometimes the greatest victory comes after the greatest fall. And Samson's final act would reveal a truth that echoes through every generation. A truth about redemption. A truth about sacrifice. A truth about the mysterious ways God can turn even broken lives into powerful instruments of His purpose. And the final chapter of Samson's story would prove that even in darkness, God can still bring light. The Philistines believed the story of Samson was finished. The man who had once terrorized their armies now stood blind and powerless inside a prison in Gaza. The warrior who had carried city gates and defeated thousands of soldiers had been reduced to a slave, grinding grain. To the Philistines, it was proof of victory. Their enemy was broken. Their god, Dagon, had triumphed, and so they prepared a massive celebration. Thousands gathered inside the great temple of Dagon. The rulers of the Philistines were there, along with nobles, soldiers, and crowds eager to witness the humiliation of the man who had caused them so much fear. The temple was packed with people. 3,000 more stood on the roof above, watching the spectacle below. Music echoed through the hall. Voices shouted in triumph. And at the center of the celebration was Samson, blind, weak, led by the hand of a young servant boy. To the crowd, he was nothing more than entertainment. They laughed. They mocked him. They celebrated the downfall of the man who once seemed unstoppable. But the Philistines misunderstood something crucial. They thought Samson's strength had come from himself. They thought removing his hair had permanently destroyed his power. They believed their victory was final. But they had forgotten the one who had given Samson strength in the first place. As Samson stood in the temple, surrounded by enemies, he asked the servant guiding him for a small request. "Let me feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." The boy led him forward until Samson's hands rested on the two central pillars that held the massive structure in place. One pillar stood to his left, the other to his right. Between them, the weight of the entire temple rested, and in that moment, Samson did something he had not done throughout most of his life. He prayed. The strongest man in Israel had spent years relying on his own power, but now, blind and humbled, he turned to God. The Bible records his prayer with haunting simplicity. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more." It was not a long prayer, not a complicated prayer, just a cry from a broken heart, a final appeal for strength, not for pride, not for glory, but for one last act. And then Samson placed his hands firmly against the pillars, one hand on the left, one hand on the right. With every ounce of strength he had left, he pushed. The massive pillars began to tremble. Stone cracked. Dust fell from the ceiling. The laughter of the Philistines slowly turned into confusion. Then fear. Then chaos. The entire temple began to collapse. Walls crumbled. The roof shattered. Thousands of people were buried beneath the falling structure. In one final moment of sacrifice, Samson brought down the temple upon himself and the rulers of the Philistines. The Bible tells us something astonishing about that moment. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Samson's final act became the greatest blow ever dealt to the Philistine leadership. The man who had been mocked as powerless had become the instrument of their destruction. And in that final moment, Samson fulfilled the purpose spoken over his life before he was born. He began the deliverance of Israel. But Samson's story is not remembered simply because of its dramatic ending. It continues to resonate because it reflects something deeply human. Samson was not a perfect hero. He was impulsive, stubborn, often reckless. He made choices that led to pain and loss. Yet, despite his flaws, God still used him. His story reminds us that divine purpose does not belong only to flawless people. In fact, some of the most powerful moments in the Bible come from individuals who struggled, failed, and fell, but eventually turned back to God. Samson's life carries a warning. Great strength without discipline can lead to destruction. Great calling without obedience can lead to tragedy. But his life also carries a message of hope. Even after failure, even after loss, redemption is still possible. Samson's greatest victory came not at the height of his power, but in the moment he finally surrendered to God. That truth echoes far beyond the ancient world of judges and warriors, because the story of Samson is not only about a man who lived 3,000 years ago. It is about every person who wrestles with weakness, every person who struggles between calling and temptation, every person who wonders whether failure has ruined their future. Samson's story answers that question with surprising clarity. Failure does not have to be the end. Sometimes it becomes the moment when a person finally discovers where their true strength comes from. And that may be the greatest lesson hidden inside this ancient story. Real strength is not found in muscles, not in power, not in victory. True strength is found in humility before God. And sometimes the greatest redemption begins when everything else has fallen apart.